Good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where history's most remarkable lives unfold in the gentle hours before sleep. Tonight, we journey back to 20th century China, where ancient traditions collide with modern ambitions, and where a billion lives would be shaped by one man's vision. His name was Mao Zedong. His legacy, well, that depends on who you ask. To some, he was the great helmsman who steered China from humiliation to power. To others, he was the architect of catastrophes that claimed more lives than both world wars combined. Before we begin tonight's journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps other sleepy souls find these stories. And let us know in the comments which historical figure we should explore next. Now, Mao gets invoked constantly these days, but strip away the propaganda and the horror stories, and you find something more unsettling: a brilliant peasant boy who read himself into revolution, who understood power better than perhaps anyone, and who genuinely believed he could redesign human nature itself. So settle in now and let your mind drift back through time, across oceans and continents, to a China that was ancient and dying, and about to be reborn in fire. Let the day's concerns fade as we explore how one man's will could bend the arc of history, for better and for worse, forever changing not just China, but the very idea of what revolution could mean. This is the bedtime biography of Mao Zedong. Chapter 1: The Fostered Child of the Bodhisattva. In the winter of 1893, in a small village tucked into the hills of Hunan province, a woman knelt before a shrine. Her name was Wen Qimei. She'd already buried 2 sons. The grief had carved hollows beneath her eyes, left her nights sleepless with worry that the gods had forgotten her entirely. So she prayed to Guan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Not just any prayer, but something more desperate, more binding. She asked the goddess to become her next child's foster mother, to wrap this baby in divine protection, to keep death from visiting her door again. 3 days later, on December 26th, her 3rd son arrived, screaming into the world. She named him Zedong, the dawn of the east, though perhaps she should have noticed how the winter wind rattled the windows that night, how even the midwife remarked on the child's unusual stubbornness, refusing to emerge until well past midnight. The boy would grow up in a house at war with itself. His father, Mao Yichong, was what you might call a self-made tyrant. He'd clawed his way from debt to become a rich peasant, dealing grain with the ruthlessness of a man who tasted poverty and found it bitter. Every grain of rice was counted. Every moment of idleness was punished with the back of his hand. Young Zedong learned the architecture of power before he could properly write his own name. His father was the ruling power, as he'd later call it. His mother, his younger brother, and himself formed what he termed the opposition. It sounds almost playful when you say it like that, but there was nothing playful about the welts on his back, the curses that rained down for reading by candlelight, the constant accusations of laziness and disrespect. Here's what shaped him. In that drafty farmhouse where the cooking smoke never quite cleared, he watched his gentle Buddhist mother submit again and again to his father's rage. He felt the sting of helplessness, that particular poison that enters the blood when you're small and someone large is hurting someone you love. And he made a decision that would echo through Chinese history. Submission was death. Rebellion was the only way to survive. By 13, he'd quit the local school rather than endure another beating from the teacher. His father raged, of course, but Zedong had discovered something more powerful than his father's fists: books. Hidden away at night, reading by candlelight while his father slept, he devoured stories of emperors and rebels, of kingdoms that rose and fell on the strength of a single man's will. The fostered child of the Bodhisattva was learning his first lessons in revolution, not from Marx or Lenin, those would come later, but from the simple, brutal education of a house divided against itself, where love and cruelty shared the same roof, where survival meant choosing a side. Chapter 2. The Threshold of a New World. His father arranged the marriage when Zedong was 14. The bride, Liu Yigu, was 4 years older, a distant cousin with a gentle face and calloused hands. The wedding proceeded according to ancient custom. Red banners hung from the doorways. The matchmaker collected her fee. Everyone pretended not to notice the groom's clenched jaw, the way his eyes searched for exits like a trapped animal. Zedong refused to consummate the marriage. He wouldn't share her bed, wouldn't even share her table. When his father threatened him with violence, he threatened right back. When the village elders came to lecture him about duty and tradition, he laughed in their faces. Finally, he simply disappeared into the mountains for a year, leaving his humiliated bride to face the whispers alone. She died of dysentery 3 years later. He never mentioned her again except once, decades later, to dismiss the whole affair as feudal nonsense. But perhaps in those quiet moments before sleep, he remembered her face, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day, hopeful despite everything. Another casualty of his war against the old world. At 16, something shifted. Maybe it was the book he'd found, Words of Warning to an Affluent Age, with its visions of a modernized China. Maybe it was simply the unbearable weight of staying still. He convinced his father to let him attend the Dongshan Higher Primary School 15 miles from home. His father agreed, but only after extracting promises of future profits from his son's education. The morning he left, Zedong composed a poem, not a particularly good poem, but one that revealed everything about the boy who would become Mao. "My studies will bring me glory," he wrote, "and I'll never return to this place." He meant it. The village that had birthed him would see him again only as a conqueror. At Dongshan, he was a curiosity, a peasant boy among the merchant's sons, wearing patched clothes that marked him as clearly as a brand. His Shangtan dialect drew snickers. His gangly frame, already approaching 6 feet, made him impossible to ignore. The other boys called him the wild one from Shaosan. But here's what they didn't understand. Every sneer, every whispered joke, every moment of exclusion was being carefully catalogued in that remarkable mind. He was learning how humiliation worked, how class worked, how power flowed through seemingly innocent social interactions. He was taking notes on empire, even if he didn't know it yet. He found his weapons in the library. Liang Qi Chao's reformist writings became his Bible. He memorized entire passages about constitutional monarchy, about the desperate need for China to modernize or perish. He read them so many times he could recite them like prayers, or perhaps more accurately, like incantations, words that might transform reality if spoken with enough conviction. The threshold had been crossed. There would be no going back to the rice fields, no returning to his father's grain shop. The boy from Shaosan was becoming something else entirely. Chapter 3. I Think, Therefore I Am. Changsha hit him like a slap of cold water. 1911, and the provincial capital thrummed with an energy that made his village feel like a tomb. Electric lights blazed in shop windows. Students in Western suits argued revolution in tea houses. Newspapers arrived daily, their pages crackling with manifestos and declarations of war against the old order. Zedong had never seen a newspaper before. Now he devoured them like a starving man, spending his food money on subscriptions, going hungry to feed his mind instead. One paper in particular caught fire in his hands. The People's Strength, edited by revolutionaries who spoke of Sun Yat-sen as if he were the second coming. They called for the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty, for a republic, for blood if necessary. He wrote his first political essay that autumn, posted it on the school wall for everyone to see. It was raw, unpolished, burning with the particular fury of youth discovering injustice for the first time. He called for a new government with Sun Yat-sen as president, something that seemed about as likely as his father embracing Buddhism. But revolution was in the air, and young men were drunk on possibility. Then he cut off his queue, that long braid that every Chinese man wore, that symbol of submission to the Manchu overlords. He convinced his classmates to join him, and together they ambushed other students, forcibly liberating them from their pigtails with scissors and knives. The barber shop revolution, they called it. His first taste of political violence, and how sweet it was. When the actual revolution came that October, he enlisted immediately. 6 months in the new army where he learned to march and shoot and follow orders. More importantly, he learned he hated following orders. He spent most of his time reading in the barracks, hiring other soldiers to fetch his water while he studied political treatises. His fellow recruits thought him either lazy or mad, perhaps both. After his discharge, he drifted. Law school for a month, police school for a few weeks, business school for exactly 3 days before deciding commerce was beneath him. His father's letters grew increasingly furious, threatening to cut off funds. Zedong ignored them all. Instead, he disappeared into the provincial Hunan library. For 6 months, he became a ghost haunting the reading rooms, arriving when they opened, leaving only when forced out at closing. He discovered a map of the world and stared at it for hours, amazed to find China was not in fact the center of everything. He read Adam Smith and Darwin, Rousseau and Montesquieu, consuming Western thought like a fever. Finally, almost by accident, he enrolled in the provincial First Normal School. Teaching seemed respectable enough to placate his father, but it was here he met Professor Yang Chongji, and everything changed. Yang had studied in Japan and Scotland, bringing back dangerous ideas about will and power and the individual's right to remake the world. Yang introduced him to Friedrich Paulson's A System of Ethics. In the margins, Zedong scrolled notes that would have horrified his Buddhist mother. I am responsible only to myself. I am my own God. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had found a new religion, himself. Chapter 4. The Great Union of the Popular Masses. April 1918. Zedong gathered his closest friends in a small room overlooking the Xiang River. Kai Han was there, brilliant and tubercular, coughing between cigarettes. Xiao Yu, who'd walked across China with him the previous summer, begging meals from peasants to prove they could survive on nothing. A dozen others, all young men, convinced they were special, which is to say, all young men. They called themselves the Renovation of the People's Study Society. The name was deliberately bland, designed to slip past suspicious authorities. Their stated goal was equally harmless: to reform academic studies, to improve character, to ameliorate customs, the kind of thing that made officials yawn and look elsewhere. But in private, after the tea grew cold and the night pressed against the windows, they talked about transforming the world, not just China, the entire world. The audacity of it, these provincial boys in their threadbare robes planning global revolution by candlelight. Yet, stranger things had happened. Lenin had just taken Russia with a handful of conspirators. Why not them? The May 4th movement exploded like a bomb. The following spring, students in Beijing protested the Treaty of Versailles, which handed German concessions in China to Japan instead of returning them to Chinese control. The protests spread like wildfire. Changsha caught flame within days. Zedong threw himself into organizing. He founded the Hunan Students' Association, coordinating strikes and demonstrations. But his real weapon was the pen. He became editor of the Xiang River Review, writing most of the content himself under various pseudonyms, arguing with himself in print, creating the illusion of a movement where there was mostly just one angry young man with too much energy. His masterpiece came that summer, The Great Union of the Popular Masses. The title sounds grander than it was,
A pamphlet, really, written in a fevered rush between teaching classes and organizing protests, but it caught something in the air, that moment when everything seemed possible. He'd been reading Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist prince who preached mutual aid over mutual slaughter. The influence showed. If peasants, workers, students, women, everyone who'd been stepped on, if they all joined together and simply roared, the old world would crumble. No blood necessary, just voices, millions of voices crying out as one. It was hopelessly naive, of course. Within months, warlords would shut down his journal, and he'd flee Changsha with a price on his head. But the article spread across China anyway, reprinted in radical journals from Shanghai to Guangzhou. For the first time, the name Mao Zedong meant something beyond Hunan province. Strange to think he still believed in bloodless revolution then, that he thought the old world would simply step aside if asked loudly enough. The boy who'd fought his father with his fists, who'd forced haircuts at knife point, somehow imagined that bigger battles could be won with words alone. But perhaps that's how it always begins, with hope, before the hope calcifies into something harder, something that knows exactly what price must be paid and is willing to pay it. The bloodless revolution would last exactly as long as it took for the first blood to spill. Chapter 5. The Path to Communism. August 1918, and Beijing swallowed him whole. $8 a month as a library assistant at Peking University, barely enough for a room in a boarding house where 6 other students slept on the same kang. They took turns staying awake, keeping the cold fire burning through the frozen nights. Bedbugs feasted, everyone scratched, nobody complained. His boss was Li Dao, the head librarian who kept Marx and Kropotkin hidden behind volumes of Confucius. Li had a round face and a gentle manner that concealed revolutionary dreams. He spoke of the Bolsheviks like others spoke of ancestors, with reverence and intimate knowledge. The future, he told Zedong, would belong to the red flag. The university intellectuals ignored the shabby assistant from Hunan. When he tried to ask questions after lectures, professors looked through him like glass. His southern accent marked him as provincial. His patched clothes marked him as poor. He was furniture that filed books, nothing more. But Chen Duxiu noticed him. The dean of letters, founder of New Youth magazine, the most dangerous mind in China, Chen had a weakness for angry young men who read too much. They'd sit in his office smoking through his Turkish cigarettes while dissecting Marx's Capital. Chen's interpretations lit fires in Zedong's mind. Here was the science that explained everything. Why his father could tyrannize his mother. Why peasants starved while landlords grew fat. Why the world felt broken. Then there was Yang Kaihui, Professor Yang's daughter, 17 years old, with a mind like a razor and eyes that saw straight through him. She'd grown up surrounded by radical thought, could quote Ibsen and argue anarchism with anyone. They'd walk along the frozen lakes of Beijing, their breath making clouds as they planned the revolution between stolen kisses. His mentor, Professor Yang, was dying, stomach cancer eating him from within while he continued lecturing on ethics and will. He seemed to approve of his daughter's choice, this wild student who scribbled notes in library margins. Perhaps he saw something others missed, or perhaps dying men simply care less about propriety. Winter passed into spring. The May 4th explosion called him back to Hunan, but Beijing had changed him. He carried Marx in his head now, that terrible clarity that turned history into science and science into prophecy. Li Dao's words echoed, the red flag, the inevitable dawn. He returned to Beijing once more in early 1920. Professor Yang was dead. Kaihui wore white mourning clothes that made her skin look like porcelain. They married quietly that winter, without ceremony or permission. 2 orphans of the old world, preparing to birth the new. Years later, someone asked him when he became a Marxist. He couldn't give an exact date, but it was there, in that frozen city where nobody knew his name, where bedbugs drank his blood while he dreamed of revolution, where a girl who understood him and a book that explained everything converged into destiny.
Chapter 6: Founding the Communist Party. Spring 1920, and a Russian named Voitinsky arrived in Shanghai carrying Comintern gold and orders from Moscow. Find the Chinese radicals, give them money, give them direction, build the party that would set Asia ablaze. He moved through radical circles like a whisper, this gray man with his careful Mandarin and briefcase full of rubles. Chen Dechu met him first. By August, Chen had gathered his disciples in a Shanghai girls' school empty for summer break. They founded the first communist cell while cicadas screamed in the plane trees outside. The revolution would begin in a classroom that smelled of chalk and teenage perfume. Back in Changsha, Zedong received Chen's letter, "Build a cell in Hunan, find the reliable ones." He already knew who they were. His renovation of the People's Study Society became something harder, sharper. No more vague talk of ameliorating customs. They studied Lenin now, learned to speak of proletarian dictatorship without flinching. He ran a bookstore as cover, selling anarchist pamphlets and romance novels side by side. The local warlord spies bought their penny dreadfuls there, never noticing the back room where young men read State and Revolution by candlelight, hiding in plain sight, that old magician's trick. July 23, 1921, Zedong and Heishu Hen took the train to Shanghai, third class, sleeping upright among farmers and their chickens. 12 other delegates converged from across China. Together, they represented all 53 members of the Chinese Communist Party. You could fit the entire revolution in a single rail car. They met in the French concession in a girls' school. Again, someone had a sense of humor, or perhaps revolutions always begin in borrowed spaces, in the cracks between what is and what might be. Mering, the Dutch Comintern agent, chain-smoked while explaining Moscow's line, "Unite with Sun Yat-sen's nationalists, infiltrate, influence, wait." On the 5th night, a stranger entered, claiming to be looking for someone. Wrong address. He apologized, backing out, but Mering knew the smell of a police spy. They scattered within minutes, reconvening days later on a pleasure boat on South Lake, pretending to be tourists while founding a party that would rule 1 billion people. The program they adopted was pure Moscow boilerplate: overthrow capitalism, establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, as if China had a proletariat to speak of, this nation of peasants and warlords. But nobody mentioned the contradiction. Revolution was a science, and science was universal. Marx said so. They elected Chen Duxiu as Secretary General, though he wasn't even there, being too important to attend his own party's founding. Zedong returned to Changsha as Secretary of the Hunan cell, not the top, but close enough to taste power. 53 members. Within 28 years, they'd rule China. Within 50, nearly 1 billion people would live under their red flag. But that night on the lake, they were just young men in a rented boat arguing about the future while pretending to admire the lotus flowers. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had found his church at last. Not Buddhism, not individualism, but this hard foreign faith that promised to explain everything and change everything. He was 27 years old. The boy from Shaosan was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous. Chapter 7: The United Front and the Break. January 1924, and Zedong sat in a Canton assembly hall watching Sun Yat-sen remake his nationalist party. Soviet advisors whispered in Sun's ear. Comintern gold paid for the proceedings. The marriage between communists and nationalists was being blessed by Moscow, whether anyone liked it or not. They elected him a candidate member of the Kuomintang Central Executive Committee, a communist wearing a nationalist mask. Or maybe it was the other way around. Nobody quite knew anymore. The Russians had decreed this united front, and so they all pretended to be one happy revolutionary family.
He threw himself into the work, acting director of propaganda by 1925, churning out pamphlets that mixed Sun's three principles with Lenin's revolution. The words came easily. He'd learned to speak from both sides of his mouth, a necessary skill when your allies were also your future enemies. But something else consumed him now. The peasants. He'd returned to Hunan in early 1927 to investigate the rural uprising. What he found intoxicated him more than any theory. Peasants were killing landlords, parading them through villages in tall paper hats before executing them in the town square. Revolutionary justice, raw and immediate. His report shocked even the communists. He praised the violence, called it necessary, beautiful even. Revolution wasn't dinner party etiquette, it was terror, and terror was good. The poorest peasants, the ones others called riffraff, they were the true vanguard. Let them destroy everything. From destruction would come paradise. March 1925, Sun Yat-sen died of cancer. Chiang Kai-shek seized control, this former gangster with his Methodist wife and German military advisors. He smiled at his communist allies while sharpening his knives. Everyone could feel it coming, that moment when the masks would drop. April 12, 1927, Shanghai awoke to machine gun fire. Chiang soldiers and Green Gang thugs moved through the city, dragging communists from their beds. They shot them in the streets, threw them alive into locomotive furnaces. The White Terror had begun. Thousands died in days. The United Front was dead, drowned in blood. The party scattered, went underground. Those who could fled to the mountains. Zedong escaped to Hunan, his head worth its weight in silver to whoever brought it to Chiang. He'd learned something valuable from the massacre. Never trust anyone stronger than you. Never be the weaker partner in an alliance. And when the moment comes to strike, strike first and without mercy. Chiang had taught him that lesson in the blood of his comrades. The party ordered him to lead an uprising that autumn, the autumn harvest uprising they'd call it later, though it was more like a winter funeral. His ragtag army of peasants and deserters was crushed within weeks. He fled again, this time to the mountains of Jiangxi, where bandits ruled and government soldiers feared to tread.
Chapter 8. The Red Banner of Jinggangshan. October 1927. And Zedong climbed into the Jinggang Mems with what was left of his army. 800 men, maybe less, most carrying rusty rifles and opium dreams. The mountains rose like broken teeth from the Hunan-Jiangxi border, shrouded in mist that made government troops nervous. Perfect bandit country. 2 bandit chiefs already ruled here, Yuan Wen-kai and Wang Zuo. Former monks turned outlaws, commanded 600 men between them. They knew every hidden path, every cave where a man could disappear forever. Zedong needed them more than dignity allowed. He brought gifts, rifles for Yuan, medicine for Wang's wounded men. They drank rice wine together while sizing each other up. 3 kings of nothing negotiating over mountains and mist. By winter, they'd made their deal. The bandits got legitimacy, a cause to dignify their theft. Zedong got sanctuary and soldiers who knew how to survive. Spring brought He Zizhen, 18 years old, sent to the mountains for safety after the White Terror. She could shoot, ride, and quote marks, a combination that apparently worked for him. They started sharing a blanket that winter. Nobody asked about Yang Kai-wei, his wife waiting in Changsha with their 3 sons. Revolution had its own morality. April 1938. Zhu De arrived with 1,000 soldiers from a failed uprising in Nanchang. Zhu was everything Zedong wasn't, professional soldier trained in Germany, calm where Zedong burned hot. Together they formed the 4th Red Army, the poet and the soldier, building something from nothing in those misty mountains. They invented guerrilla warfare through necessity. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When he camps, we harass. When he tires, we attack. When he retreats, we pursue. Simple rules for complicated times.
Strike the weak points, vanish into mountains, make the enemy fear shadows. The first Soviet appeared almost by accident. They needed food, so they redistributed land, killed the landlords, gave their fields to peasants who'd worked them for generations. The peasants didn't care about Marx or global revolution, but free land, that they understood. Word spread through the valleys. The Reds were giving away land. Peasant boys joined by the hundreds, bringing nothing but hunger and rage. Zedong taught them to read with simplified characters, taught them their poverty wasn't fate, but theft. Someone had stolen their lives. Time to steal them back. Meanwhile, in Changsha, Yang Kaihui waited. The nationalists offered her freedom if she'd denounce her husband. She refused. They executed her in 1930, left her body by the city wall. His 3 sons scattered to relatives or simply disappeared. Revolution demanded its sacrifices. By 1930, the Jiangxi Soviet covered 6 counties, 20,000 soldiers under the Red Banner. They'd proven something everyone thought impossible. A communist state could exist inside China, could survive, could grow from bandits and dreamers in the mountains. They'd become something real enough to threaten Chiang's sleep. King of the mountain at last. Not the emperor he dreamed of becoming as a boy, but close enough to taste what might come next. Chapter 9. The Long March and the Rise to Power. October 1934, and the Red Army was bleeding out. Chiang's 5th encirclement campaign had worked. German advisors taught his troops to build blockhouses, thousands of them, tightening like a noose around the Jiangxi Soviet. No more hit and run, just slow strangulation. 86,000 soldiers broke through the lines at night, carrying everything on their backs. The Long March had begun, though nobody called it that yet. It was just running, desperate and directionless, while nationalist planes dropped bombs and pamphlets promising amnesty for surrender. The party leadership was in chaos. Bo Gu, 28 years old and Moscow trained, commanded because Moscow said so. Otto Braun, the German Comintern advisor, planned battles from maps that bore no relation to Chinese reality. They moved the army like Europeans in straight lines into killing fields. 3 months in, 40,000 were dead. The Xiang River ran red for days after they forced a crossing under artillery fire. Equipment abandoned, wounded left behind. The survivors marched on, bleeding feet through provinces where nobody spoke their dialect, where local warlords sold them safe passage by the mile. January 1935, they captured Zunyi, a prosperous town where they could rest. The leadership gathered in a merchant's house to assign blame for the disaster. Zedong had been waiting for this moment, marginalized for 3 years by the Moscow faction. Now he struck. For 3 days, he dissected their failures with surgical precision. Bo Gu's rigid positional warfare, Braun's European fantasies, the stupidity of fighting the enemy's strength instead of his weakness. The other commanders listened, these practical men who'd seen their armies destroyed by foreign theories. When the vote came, they sided with the Chinese fighter over the Moscow boys. He joined the Politburo Standing Committee, became Zhou Enlai's military assistant, not supreme leader, not yet, but close enough to steer decisions. The poet guerrilla was back in command, and the dying stopped. Almost immediately, the tactics changed. Feints and circles, doubling back, making Chiang's armies chase ghosts. They crossed the Yangtze on fishing boats, climbed mountains where the air ran out, crossed grasslands that swallowed men whole. The Dadu River, where a handful of soldiers took a bridge under fire, climbing hand over hand across chains while flames consumed the planks below. Every disaster became legend in the retelling. October 1935, 1 year after starting, 5,000 survivors reached northern Shanxi. They'd walked 6,000 miles through 12 provinces, fought 15 major battles, crossed 18 mountain ranges. 90% were dead or scattered, but the ones who survived were harder than iron. In the caves of Yan'an, they rebuilt. This time, Zedong held the power. The long march had made him, not through Moscow's blessing, but through Chinese blood and Chinese suffering. The intellectuals who doubted him were dead or discredited. What remained was his vision, his will, his party. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had become what he'd always imagined, not through books or theories, but through the oldest path to power, survival when others died. He was 42 years old, and he'd just begun.
Chapter 10: The Yan'an Years and the Second United Front. December 1936, and China's fate turned on a kidnapping. Zhang Shuilang, the young marshal whose Manchurian homeland the Japanese had stolen, couldn't stomach fighting communists while Japan devoured China. So he took Chiang Kai-shek hostage in Xi'an, held a gun to the general's head, and demanded he fight the real enemy. Stalin sent urgent telegrams from Moscow. Don't kill Chiang, need him alive to fight Japan, to bleed the Japanese army before it turns north toward Russia. Zheng wanted Chiang dead, but Moscow held the purse strings. So they negotiated. Chiang walked free, and the Second United Front was born. Communists and nationalists would fight Japan together. Supposedly, the war gave Zhang Dong what he needed most: time. While Chiang's armies bled, fighting Japanese regulars, the communists grew in the shadows. They fought too, guerrilla actions behind Japanese lines, but carefully preserving strength for the real war everyone knew was coming. Yan'an became their capital, a city of caves carved into yellow cliffs. Foreign journalists arrived, charmed by the Spartan democracy they thought they saw. Edgar Snow wrote Red Star over China, turning Zhang Dong into a global figure, the romantic revolutionary writing poetry in his cave while building a new world. What Snow didn't see was the Rectification Campaign, 1942. Zhang Dong decided the party needed purifying. Intellectuals who'd questioned him found themselves in struggle sessions, confessing imaginary crimes until they broke. Wang Shiwei, a writer who'd criticized party privilege, disappeared into a ravine with a bullet in his head. The method was brilliant. Make them confess, make them grateful for redemption, make them love their torturer. Break the mind, rebuild it in your image. The foster child had learned his father's lessons. After all, terror worked if properly applied. He wrote constantly during these years, on protracted war, on new democracy, building the theoretical framework for Chinese communism, which looked nothing like Russian communism, but wore its mask. The peasants were the sea, the army fish swimming through them. Revolution came from the countryside, not factories. Marx with Chinese characteristics, though Marx wouldn't have recognized his own ideas. His personal life grew complicated. His wife, pregnant again, broken by the long march, grew difficult. She threw a bowl at him during dinner with Agnes Smedley, the American journalist who gazed at him with worshipful eyes. He Zizhen was sent to Moscow for medical treatment. She'd never return as his wife. Her replacement arrived from Shanghai, Jiang Qing, an actress with a dubious past and ambitious eyes. The party leaders opposed the match, but Zhang didn't ask permission anymore. They married in 1938, his fourth wife if you counted them all, which nobody did. By 1945, when Japan surrendered, the communists controlled base areas with 90 million people, 1 million soldiers under arms, ready for the final struggle. The war against Japan was over. The war for China could finally begin. Chapter 11: The Civil War and the Visit to the Red Mecca. August 1945, and 2 atomic flashes ended the Japanese Empire. Chiang and Zhang Dong circled each other like fighters who'd been waiting too long for this moment. The Americans flew Zhang Dong to Chongqing for peace talks. He smiled for photographers, toasted peace with Chiang, then flew back to Yan'an to plan war. The fighting started before the toasts dried.
Manchuria first, where Soviet troops had conveniently left Japanese weapons for the communists to find. 700,000 rifles, 14,000 machine guns, enough to arm peasants who'd been sharpening farm tools into spears. Chiang had everything on paper: 4 million troops, American weapons, control of every major city. The communists had 800,000 soldiers and countryside that went dark after sunset. It should have been no contest. Paper warriors usually win paper wars. But Zhang Dong understood something Chiang didn't. Cities were traps. Let the nationalists garrison them, feed them, defend them. Meanwhile, the People's Liberation Army moved through Chinese countryside like water, surrounding cities, cutting supply lines, making each garrison a prison of its own making. The nationalist armies rotted from within. Corrupt officers sold weapons to the enemy. Conscripts deserted by divisions, switching sides for a bowl of rice and land reform promises. By 1948, Chiang's advantage had evaporated. Manchuria fell, then Beijing, then the Yangtze. October 1st, 1949, Zhang Dong stood atop Tiananmen Gate, the same spot where emperors had proclaimed their mandates. His Hunan accent rang through loudspeakers across the square. The People's Republic of China was born. The peasant boy had conquered an empire. 2 months later, he boarded a train for Moscow, his first time leaving China, going to meet Stalin, the Red God himself. The journey took 10 days through Siberian winter. He practiced Russian phrases, rehearsed conversations, prepared to meet his equal. Stalin kept him waiting, put him in a dacha outside Moscow like a poor relative, made him beg for meetings. When they finally met, Stalin treated him like a provincial administrator, not the leader of 600 million people. Every slight was calculated, every humiliation precise. The negotiations dragged through winter. Stalin wanted control of Chinese ports, railways, resources, wanted China as a buffer, not a partner. Zhang Dong smiled, agreed to what he had to, remembered everything. They signed a treaty of friendship in February 1950. Both men knew it was really a treaty of mutual suspicion. On the train home, Zhang Dong was quiet. His aides thought he was tired, but he was thinking about power. Real power, the kind that didn't have to beg for recognition. Stalin had shown him something important. Even communists could be imperialists. Even comrades could be enemies. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had met his God and found him wanting. Time to become his own God instead.
Chapter 12: The Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine. And Zhang was done with patience. Stalin was dead. Khrushchev was weak. And China still crawled while it should be running. He'd visited Moscow again, seen their factories, their bombs. If the Soviets could industrialize in a decade, China could do it in 3 years. Will was everything. Will and mobilized masses. The Great Leap Forward began with numbers that defied reality. China would surpass Britain in steel production by 1972. No, by 1968. Actually, make it 1960. The targets kept rising because nobody dared question the chairman's vision. To doubt was to reveal yourself as a rightist, and rightists disappeared. 600 million people reorganized overnight into people's communes. Private plots vanished. Personal chickens became collective property. Families ate in communal dining halls, thousands together, while propaganda teams sang songs about abundance that didn't exist. Then came the backyard furnaces. Every commune needed to make steel. Peasants who'd never seen a factory were ordered to build furnaces in their courtyards. They fed them with pots, pans, doorknobs, ancestral bells. The metal they produced was useless, brittle slag.
but the numbers looked good on reports to Beijing. Agriculture collapsed first. Millions of farmers were making worthless steel instead of harvesting grain. Those still farming followed instructions from Moscow-trained scientists who knew nothing about Chinese soil. Plant seeds close together for socialist solidarity. Deep plowing for deeper revolution. The crops failed, but the reports claimed record harvests. Local officials, terrified of being purged, reported impossible grain yields. 2,000 pounds per acre became 4,000, then 10,000. Zedong believed them, because he wanted to. If socialism was scientific, these numbers must be true. Science couldn't lie. The state took grain based on the fictional harvests. Villages that supposedly produced 10 tons had to deliver 8 to the cities. It didn't matter that they'd actually grown 2. The grain was taken at gunpoint. Peasants who hid food were beaten to death as counter-revolutionaries. By winter 1959, people were eating bark, then grass, then nothing. Villages went silent, everyone too weak to bury the dead. In Hunan province, there were reports of parents eating children. Officials who reported the famine were purged for spreading capitalist propaganda. Peng Dehuai, the defense minister who'd fought beside Zedong since Jinggangshan, dared to criticize the policies at the Lushan conference. Zedong destroyed him, labeled him a rightist, had him tortured during the Cultural Revolution. The message was clear. Truth was whatever the chairman said it was. By 1961, even Zedong couldn't ignore the catastrophe. The policies quietly changed, but the dying continued. Somewhere between 20 and 45 million people starved to death. The exact number remains unknown. The party still calls it the 3 years of natural disasters, as if nature, not politics, had caused the famine. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had become death itself, the destroyer of worlds, and he was just getting started.
Chapter 13. Unleashing the Cultural Revolution. And Zong felt power slipping through his fingers like sand. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping ran the country day to day, undoing his radical policies with their capitalist road reforms. They smiled at him, called him chairman, then ignored his instructions. He was becoming what he feared most, a figurehead, a living monument to someone he used to be. He told Edgar Snow the truth that winter. China needed more personality cult, not less. The cult would be his weapon to destroy the party bureaucrats who'd caged him. If the party wouldn't obey, he'd go around them, straight to the youth who'd grown up singing his name. May 16th, the Cultural Revolution began with a circular from Beijing. Bourgeois elements had infiltrated the party. They must be swept away. But the real signal came when his wife, Zhang Qing, attacked a historical play about an honest official dismissed by a corrupt emperor. Everyone understood the play was about Peng Dehuai. The emperor was Zong, and criticizing Zong was now a capital crime. He wrote his own big character poster that July, "Bombard the headquarters," 3 words that gave teenagers permission to destroy their world. The Red Guards were born, middle school students with red armbands and little red books, drunk on power no teenager should possess. August 18th, he stood at Tiananmen reviewing 1,000,000 Red Guards. A teenage girl pinned a red armband on his sleeve. He asked her name, Song Binbin, meaning gentle and courteous. He smiled. "Be violent," he told her. She changed her name to Sun Yao Wu. Be violent became her identity. The violence came immediately. Teachers beaten to death with belt buckles. Intellectuals forced to kneel on broken glass while confessing imaginary crimes. the jet plane position, arms wrenched behind backs until shoulders dislocated. Old women with bourgeois hairstyles had their heads shaved with broken glass. Liu Shaoqi, once Zong's chosen successor, was tortured in his own home, his children forced to denounce him. He died naked on a concrete floor, his white hair 2 feet long, denied medicine for diabetes, while his screams echoed through the prison. Deng Xiaoping's son was thrown from a 4th-floor window, paralyzed for life. The Red Guards turned on each other by 1967, different factions claiming to be more revolutionary, fighting with machine guns in the streets. In Guangxi, they literally ate class enemies, cutting out livers and hearts in public feasts to prove their revolutionary fervor. Ancient temples burned, libraries destroyed, the cemetery of Confucius desecrated, his corpse dug up and hung from a tree. 5,000 years of Chinese civilization fed to bonfires by children who thought they were building paradise. By 1968, even Zong realized the chaos had to end. He sent the Red Guards to the countryside for re-education. Millions of urban youth exiled to villages, their revolution over, their futures destroyed. They'd served their purpose. The foster child had become Saturn, devouring his own children.
Chapter 14: The Final Years of the Red Emperor. September 1971, and Lin Biao's plane crashed in Mongolia, carrying Zedong's chosen successor and alleged assassin into the desert sand. Project 571, they'd called the plot. 571 sounded like armed uprising in Mandarin. Even coups needed wordplay. The official story kept changing. Lin tried to flee to the Soviet Union. No, he was defecting. Actually, he'd planned to bomb Zedong's train. The truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that Zedong's closest comrade, the man who'd compiled his little red book, had betrayed him, or been betrayed. Nobody knew anymore. The crash broke something in Zedong. He aged overnight, stopped reading documents, spent days in bed staring at nothing. His body was failing. Congestive heart failure made his legs swell like balloons. Lou Gehrig's disease slowly paralyzed his throat. The god was becoming mortal. February 1972, Nixon arrived in Beijing, the anti-communist crusader shaking hands with the great helmsman while snow fell on the Forbidden City. Zedong could barely stand, but he managed 3 hours of verbal sparring, joking about nuclear war while the world held its breath. The meeting was pure calculation. America needed an exit from Vietnam. China needed protection from Soviet missiles. 2 enemies embracing because they feared a third enemy more. Kissinger called it realpolitik. Zedong called it using barbarians to control barbarians, an ancient Chinese strategy. His wife, Jiang Qing, grew bolder as he weakened. She ran the Gang of Four, controlling propaganda, persecuting enemies, preparing to inherit his throne. She'd perform revolutionary operas for him while he drooled, unable to speak, blinking once for yes, twice for no. Zhang Yufeng, his final mistress, became his voice, a train attendant he'd noticed years earlier, now the only person who could understand his garbled speech. She'd lean close to his lips, translate his mumbles into orders that could destroy millions. The empire ruled through a young woman's ears. 1976 arrived with omens. Zhao Enlai died in January, Zhu Dai in July. The old revolutionaries disappearing like lights going out. An earthquake destroyed Tangshan, killing hundreds of thousands. Traditional Chinese believed natural disasters meant heaven had withdrawn its mandate. September 8th, he fell into a coma. His organs shut down one by one, while the Gang of Four and the moderates plotted in adjacent rooms. At 10 minutes past midnight on September 9th, his heart stopped. The doctor had to check 3 times. Nobody could believe the immortal chairman was actually dead.
They preserved him like Lenin, pumping him full of formaldehyde, displaying him in a crystal coffin in Tiananmen Square. Millions filed past, weeping for the man who traumatized them, unable to separate their grief from their relief. The foster child of the Bodhisattva had returned to his foster mother at last, but instead of compassion, he'd brought China through every hell he could imagine, and some he couldn't.
Chapter 15. A Complicated Legacy. The party waited exactly 1 month, October 6th, 1976, and Hua Guofeng had the Gang of Four arrested. Jiang Qing screamed about betrayal as they dragged her away. At her trial, she'd say she was only Zhao Dong's dog, barking when he said bark. The court gave her death, commuted to life. She hanged herself with her own stockings in 1991. Deng Xiaoping returned from exile, that survivor who'd been purged 3 times and risen 3 times. He had a simple message. Practice was the sole criterion of truth, not Mao thought, not revolution, just what worked. Within years, he'd dismantle everything Zhao Dong built while keeping his corpse on display. The official verdict came in 1981, 70% correct, 30% wrong, a mathematical formula for a man who'd caused between 40 and 80 million deaths. They couldn't admit the full horror without admitting the party's complicity, so they split the difference, saved face, moved on. But what was that 70%? He'd unified China, yes, ended the century of humiliation that began with British opium ships, made the world respect a nation it had carved up like a melon. When he proclaimed the People's Republic, China could barely make bicycles. When he died, it had hydrogen bombs and satellites. He gave women legal equality, banned foot binding, ended arranged marriages. Literacy went from 20% to 65%. Life expectancy doubled despite the famines. The barefoot doctors he trained brought medicine to villages that had never seen aspirin. These weren't small achievements. Yet the price, those tens of millions starved in the Great Leap Forward, the millions more tortured and killed in the Cultural Revolution, the destroyed families, the ruined minds, the children who denounced parents, the parents who buried children, the lost generations sent to the countryside, their education stolen, their futures erased. Today, his portrait still watches from Tiananmen Gate, 10 stories tall, that famous mole, that knowing smile. Taxi drivers hang his picture for luck. Peasants pray to his image like a kitchen god. The young buy his merchandise ironically, without knowing what he did, or perhaps knowing and not caring. Bo Xilai tried to resurrect his ghost before they imprisoned him for corruption. The New Left quotes him against inequality. Nationalists invoke him against America. Everyone uses his corpse for their purposes, which he might have appreciated. He always said political power grew from the barrel of a gun. He never mentioned it also grew from selective memory. The foster child of the Bodhisattva left China powerful and traumatized, unified and broken, modern and afraid of its own history. He wanted to be China's greatest emperor. He succeeded. Emperors aren't loved, they're endured, survived, remembered. Walk through Beijing today and you'll see him everywhere and nowhere. In the straight boulevards he carved through ancient neighborhoods, in the old people who still won't talk about those years, in the capitalism he'd despise and the nationalism he'd recognize, in the party that rules in his name while ignoring everything he believed.
Epilogue. The Red Emperor's Global Shadow. While Zedong's body lay crystallized in Beijing, his ghost went traveling. It found fertile soil in places where poverty and rage grew thick as jungle vines. Peru, Nepal, India,
the Philippines, wherever peasants had nothing to lose but their lives, which weren't worth much anyway. The Shining Path erupted in Peru in 1980, just 4 years after his death. Abimael Guzman, a philosophy professor who called himself Chairman Gonzalo, decided Peru needed its own cultural revolution. His followers hung dead dogs from Lima's lampposts with signs reading, "Deng Xiaoping, son of a bitch." They understood the theology. Deng had betrayed the faith. Only pure Maoism could save the world. They started in Ayacucho, the poorest region of a poor country, teaching Quechua-speaking peasants that history was a spiral moving toward communism. The revolution would be beautiful and terrible. Mostly terrible. They massacred entire villages suspected of government sympathy, stoned children to death for selling cocoa to the wrong buyers. By the time Guzman was captured in 1992, 70,000 were dead. In Nepal, the ghost-owned Pushpa Kamal Dahal, who called himself Prachanda, meaning fierce one. He launched his People's War in 1996 from villages so remote the government forgot they existed. For 10 years, his fighters controlled rural Nepal, running Maoist courts, Maoist schools, teaching peasants they were the sea in which guerrillas swam. The strange part was that it worked. By 2006, Prachanda's Maoists controlled 80% of Nepal. The monarchy fell, the guerrillas entered parliament, Prachanda became prime minister, a Maoist leading a democracy. Though he'd resign and resign again, the revolution reduced to parliamentary squabbles. Zedong would have been disgusted, or maybe amused. India's Naxalites took their name from Naxalbari village where the uprising began in 1967, while Zedong still lived. They read his quotes about political power and guns, then acted on them. 50 years later, they still control vast forest regions across India's spine, the Red Corridor they call it, where tribal peoples who've been forgotten by Indian democracy learn that Chairman Mao cares about their suffering. Every few months they ambush police convoys, blow up railway tracks, execute landlords. The Indian government calls it its greatest internal security threat. They call themselves the real India, the one that never appears in Bollywood films or IT conferences. 20,000 dead and counting. The revolution grinding on like a broken clock that occasionally lurches forward. The Philippines had the New People's Army, founded in 1969 on Zedong's birthday. Naturally, they're still fighting in the mountains of Luzon and Mindanao, extorting revolutionary taxes, executing enemies of the people, occasionally killing tourists by mistake. The revolution sustained by methamphetamine sales and nostalgia for clarity in a complicated world. Even the Khmer Rouge claimed him, though they took his ideas to places even he might have flinched from. Pol Pot decided cities themselves were bourgeois. Year Zero meant returning to peasant paradise by murdering everyone who wore glasses, spoke foreign languages, had soft hands. 2 million dead in 4 years. When Vietnamese tanks finally ended it, they found pyramids of skulls and children who'd been taught to kill before they could read. The strange thing was how his image traveled even where his ideas didn't. French students in May 1968 carried his portrait alongside Che Guevara's, though they wanted sexual liberation, not peasant revolution. American Black Panthers sold his Little Red Book to buy shotguns, though Oakland wasn't Yan'an. Even Andy Warhol made him pop art, 10 different colored Maos. Revolution as aesthetic choice. Today, the Communist Party of the Philippines still sends birthday greetings to Beijing every December 26th. The Naxalites still quote his essays on guerrilla warfare. Scattered websites still insist he was 70% right, or 90, or 100. The ghost refuses to die because the conditions that created it haven't died. Poverty, humiliation, the desire to make history move faster than it wants to go. The foster child of the bodhisattva became everyone's foster father, whether they wanted him or not. His children are still out there in jungles and mountains, waiting for their moment, still believing that political power grows from gun barrels, still learning what he always knew, that revolutions are beautiful in theory and terrible in practice, that heaven can't be built on earth, only different versions of hell. But they keep trying anyway, because somewhere, in some village where the government has never delivered anything but grief, a young person is reading his words for the first time, feeling that electric shock of recognition. The world doesn't have to be this way. And why? Just maybe, it won't stay this way. The revolution is dead. Long live the revolution.